Okay, so we'll start talking about the text. Sorry about the disruption. It seems like I lost network connection from this end. So I guess I'll have to share screen once more. And I'm hoping again that you can see it. Not yet? Oh, okay. Okay, I guess. Right, no problem. Just give me a second. I'll make you the host. Yeah, because we restarted, I guess. I think you can start recording now. I think it's already recording. Okay, fine. So you can see the screen there, right? Okay, perfect. So let's get started. I was just saying that we have, Beckett was not very sure initially whether to call it a trilogy because he had a two-part arrangement in mind, in all likelihood, and eventually three-part arrangement, and in came the Unnamable. Just one quick point before we start with the text. As I said, these are all translated by the writer himself, but it's sort of important to note that there was quite a long gap that way, between the French text, L'Innommable, and the Unnamable, the English one, because it was around 1952 that he had finished the French text, and he only translated it around 56, 57. So there's a gap, 4 or 5 years. While he was writing other texts, he was writing plays. In fact, the publication of the English text almost converged with the production of his famous play Endgame. So it's interesting that there's a time lag, and because of that time lag, or because of that gap, his corpus has sort of further proceeded. And one wonders whether some of those ideas that came to him during the writing of some of the later texts fed themselves back into the English text, because there's almost like a 5-6 year gap between the French text and the English text. Now, I've already mentioned this technique of wagoning, the fact that we don't know where a character is in a typical Beckett novel. We don't know who the character is. There is no backstory to the character. There is no specific setting most of the times. We don't know what historical period are we occupying. What is the temporal landscape? So the time, the space, the character, these are things we don't know more often than not in Beckett's fiction and in his plays as well. one of the results of this, or one of the implications of this, is that you can actually place these characters anywhere you like. So they're very open that way to different kinds of contextual shifts. So yeah, I mentioned this idea of veganing, the fact that he would vegan the text. Now, again, we don't know, as I said earlier, whether this is a human subject, the unnameable, or something else. As I said, there is an understanding in the logic of the trilogy. If we follow the sort of temporal logic, that after Malone dies, what we have is just a voice, a dead voice, a voice that speaks from beyond the grave. And in that sense, this could be a sort of a modern representation of a Dantean hell, right? There's a sort of inferno where the character locates himself or itself. I'm not sure what gender to use for the unnameable. And it's located in this very peculiar place which it does not know. As we shall see, in fact, many of the initial investigations are about trying to find out what this place is, what it looks like, trying to measure the space, trying to understand what this place looks like. Anyway, let's begin with the text and we can come back to some of these discussions. So as you can see in the very beginning, the first three questions, which are very important: where now, who now, when now, right? These are the three basic questions of fiction, if you think about it. Identity, who, at the very beginning is where, the space, then the identity, the self, and then time. Usually these are the three basic sort of coordinates of any fictional world. Self, a character, let's say, a time, a period, if you want to call it that, and a setting, a space. And they are, from the very beginning, put under question mark. So we don't know. And this we don't know is very important. Beckett's fiction and the kind of fiction we are talking about, not just Beckett, in many other modernist writers, there's a tendency to write a text that does not give you knowledge, or it doesn't really make us know something in a very specific traditional sense. In fact, it questions the methods of knowing, questions the methods of knowledge. So again, we will see that same thing with Beckett. We saw a little bit of that with Gertrude Stein as well. Unquestioning. So after the three questions comes the word unquestioning, which is weird because he is questioning. I mean, let's call it maybe I'll have a few justifications for calling it a he eventually, but nevertheless, just for the sake of practical advantage, let's call it, or maybe a she. Unquestioning. But after the first three questions, the word unquestioning is also ironic, right? Because we have already read three questions. So the character says unquestioning, I say I unbelieving. So the very fact that the character is saying I, this first person pronoun, does not mean anything, because the character is not able to identify with the self, and hence who now, right? So this is an I which doesn't make much sense. I say I unbelieving. And it goes on like that. Questions, hypothesis, call them that. Keep going on. Call that going, call that on. This on, or go on, as I was saying last time, Beckett had these pathological symptoms of not being able to walk, flopping feet, not being able to continue walking. And in a very peculiar way, his prose seems to imitate that kind of stumbling walk, the difficulty of walking, the difficulty of continuing. A palindrome sequence that we often see in Beckett is this, that there's an on. Now, if you just transpose the letters, what does it become? It becomes a no, right? This is why it is called a palindrome sequence. I mean, it's like a palindromic order, where if you transpose the letters, it becomes no. On is continuation, right? And no is exactly the opposite of that, negation, right? I can't go on is no. I am going to go on is on, right? So there's that play in English that is quite strongly there. In most of the French texts, he would use the word continue or continuation, but sometimes, very rarely, especially in the second trilogy that I mentioned, he does use the French word encore, which is another word for on. So sometimes it's encore, but most of the times the word he uses is continuation, continuer in French. But there is a difference between continuation and repetition, I guess. Because the moment you say repetition, there are two iterations. That's why I'm saying repetition, right? We will repeat the point. That means I'll say it at least twice or maybe thrice or go on like that. But if I say continue, it means it's perhaps there is no break. In repetition or encore, there is a break, but in continuation, there is no break. Now, one of the things that we will see, as I said, with this character is that it tries to get an idea of what kind of space it finds itself in. What is this place? Another thing that underlines this entire text is a kind of inability to stop talking. An inability to stop talking, or a kind of logoria, where you want to stop talking, you want silence, but you can't stop talking. This is the dialectic of this text. The character has to say something about themselves in order to stop talking. But there's something or the other that prevents this character from doing that self-revelation, from doing that self-expression. So there is a self-expression that will enable silence, that will bring in silence. But the self-expression is something that the Unnamable finds it very, very difficult to accomplish or very difficult to do. Now, this question of silence, which is again one of those great themes of this book, if you think about it, all stories emerge from silence, right? And before this class, this room was an embodiment of silence. We came in, so any narrative always disturbs the silence. And then when the narrative comes to an end, we go back to the silence. But the question is, what kind of silence is the Unnamable looking for? He's not looking for a very pregnant silence where, we say this very commonly, right? It's a cliche. Silence speaks more words than actual words or whatever. He's not talking about that kind of silence, because that kind of silence is speech at some level, where your silence is meaningful, where your silence is actually responding to whatever question was asked. Sometimes we don't say something, but our silence speaks volumes, right? It's not that kind of silence, but it's a terminal silence, like the silence of death, which is impossible to make sense of. Once a person is dead, that's a different kind of a silence. So silence is attached to death or associated with the idea of death. And there's a kind of pure silence, which this entire novel seeks out. Throughout the text, there's a seeking of that silence. So let's say the novel is a quest for silence, is a quest for that pure silence, which does not speak. There's nothing in that silence, nothing that you can interpret. It's not a pregnant silence. It's not a silence that you can make sense of, right? So the inability to speak, the impossibility of self-expression, and the desire for silence. These are the three things we have briefly touched upon. Inability to fall silent, or inability to end talking, logoria, number one. This pure silence beyond all speech, which does not mean anything, which is perhaps the silence of death, and this inability, this sort of injunction to express yourself. Only by expressing yourself can you reach that silence. Can you finish talking, right? Now, because there is no context, let us at least think of two contexts, one historical, the other philosophical. As I said, these texts are located in a void. We don't know where these characters are, who these characters are, and so on. But one philosophical context would be the famous Cartesian context, and there are enough reasons to believe that Beckett was very familiar with Descartes, and especially Descartes' discourse on method. If you see, the word method is repeated again and again in this text. Even in the first 20, 30 pages, if you've read them, the word method keeps coming back. And this is a famous word in Discourse on Method, where Descartes talks about of uncertainties, and the only certainty is this axiom that he comes up with, which is like an Archimedean point. He says, I think therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. So thinking is one coordinate, existence in another, is another, being, let's say. Let's not make that distinction between being and existence at this stage. We'll complicate matters further. So Descartes talks about all kinds of uncertainties in the world, and amid all these uncertainties, the only certainty lies in this axiom: I think, therefore I am. Right? And this is what he talks about in Discourse on Method and various other texts and meditations as well. One way of looking at this novel is to see it as a kind of Cartesian theater of thinking, where thinking involves a kind of torture. Thinking involves the pains of I am, I exist. It's because we exist that we have to go through suffering, right? I'm not being particularly Buddhist about it, but it's a fact, right? If we didn't have a body, there would be no suffering. If we didn't have any embodied existence, there would be no suffering. So that I am being there causes pain, causes suffering. So there's an element of torture there. And you have to keep thinking about it. And sometimes it's not that you're thinking because you want to think. Thought happens. And that's a bit of a torture. Anyone who, especially people who have, for various reasons, suffered from compulsive thoughts. And to a certain extent, everyone has compulsive thoughts. That doesn't make us pathological necessarily. But of course, some people cannot manage it or handle it. And it goes completely out of control and then becomes a problem. But anyway, that idea of compulsive thought is one way of thinking about involuntary thinking, thought that happens to you. And that is terrifying because you can't stop thinking. You don't want to think about something. Maybe it's something unpleasant, but it keeps coming back to you. You keep finding yourself in that thought, and that becomes terrifying. We'll see what becomes specifically tortuous or terrifying in this novel. But let's say it's like an allegory of a Cartesian theater of thinking, where thinking is often to torture yourself. That's one philosophical context. The other historical context, and again, there are some reasons why, and I'll keep talking about it as we go on, why I'm context. There is a certain shadow of war here on this text, even though it's not directly talking about the war. But it's clear that we are talking about the travails of a post-war human subject, to the point that you could also see this novel as an allegory of a concentration camp. A concentration camp where a person is not just made to suffer, but this is exactly what happens in political torture, right? Not just in the Auschwitz camps. If you think about various historical situations, like for example, what happened in South Africa in 70s and 80s during the apartheid regime, right? People were tortured like this. It happened a lot in Poland. It happened in various places, right, where there was political conflict. So if you think about political torture is an attempt to extort some secret, some secret about yourself. So this whole situation where this particular person finds himself or herself in the middle of nowhere, doesn't know who are surveying him, but there is constant surveillance, and there is an attempt to make the unnameable speak of, themselves, using the gender neutral. There's an attempt to extort some self-expression. And that is, again, a very typical concentration camp situation or any kind of death camp situation, right? So another allegory one could read into, and as I said, I'm not just saying it on the surface of things. There are references to the war in this book, and we will eventually come to that. There are some, in fact, comical references to the war as well towards the end in one of the inset stories. We'll come to that eventually. But at this point, let's say these are two possible allegories. One is this, as I said, allegory of the Cartesian theater of thinking, where to think is to exist, but to think is also to torture yourself. So one is this, change colors involuntarily. One is this Cartesian idea of thinking, and thinking that becomes torture, thinking as torture, right? And the second is, of course, the war the war and the idea of camp. And of course, I mean, Beckett, as I said, another reason why we can make that connection is that he himself fought for French resistance, had to flee from the Gestapos. In fact, the previous novel that I was written while he was in hiding in this little village called Roussillon in the sort of outskirts of France, outskirts of Paris. And this is when he comes back after the war to Paris and sort of has this very intense period of writing, which is often called a siege in a room, where he practically locks himself in a room and starts writing in a sort of initial compulsive flow and then in an impulsive flow, possibly. And that's how he finishes all these three novels and later on translates them after almost 6 years. To come back to the paragraph, as I see the three questions: where now, who now, when now. No understanding of who the subject is, where the subject is, so no understanding of time, space, or subjectivity. Right? But then this inability to stop talking, the quest for silence beyond speech that doesn't mean anything, and this attempt to self-express, but that attempt to self-express gets blocked in various ways. We have this very important word here, aporia, right? Somewhere here, as we keep going, we will find this eventually. Can it be that one day off it goes on, that one day I simply stayed in where, instead of going out in the old way, out to spend as far away as possible? It wasn't far. Perhaps that is how it began. You think you're simply resting, the better to act when the time comes, or for no reason, and you soon find yourself powerless ever to do anything again, no matter how it happened. Say it, not knowing what. So again, not knowing what we are talking about, not knowing what happened. But something weird happened one day, and there was a sense of powerlessness that came in. Perhaps I simply assented at last to an old thing, but I did nothing. I seemed to speak. It is not I about me. It is not about me. These few general remarks to begin with. What am I to do? What shall I do? What should I do in my situation? How proceed? Yeah, this is the word. By aporia, pure and simple. Aporia means a kind of a blind spot or a deadlock. But this is the general nature of the narrative in the Unnamable. This is a word that Derrida was very fond of and often used, to the point that one could say the kind of dialectic Derrida eventually developed was a kind of aporetic dialectic, where thesis and antithesis would generate no synthesis, but some sort of a prosthesis, as Derrida would call. But aporia is like a blind spot, and there are so many blind spots throughout the text. Let's keep this word in mind. And again, the narrator, by the way, also says that I say aporia without knowing what it means. So there is no knowledge claim. Almost throughout the text, we'll see this. The moment a knowledge is asserted, it's also withdrawn. It's also taken away. There is no owning up of any kind of knowledge claim. But the problem is, as I say, I shall never be silent, never. So there is an obligation to speak, but there is also an understanding that there is an extortion going on here. Self-expression is being extorted by some mysterious other who is always keeping the watch on the unnamable. Seems like I can't navigate now. That's funny. Let's see. This is a perennial mystery, like the unnamable, in fact. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now I navigate by mouse, but I can't do it from the keyboard, which I was able to do earlier. Super interesting. Okay. I shall not be alone in the beginning. I am, of course, alone. Alone, that is soon saved. Things have to be soon saved. So this is again another often seen in Beckett's fiction, and the Unnamable is a typical example of that. There are many other places, like the little texts he would write after this, called Texts for Nothing, or How It Is, the sort of epic that I mentioned last time. The problem is a sort of hesitation between solitude and company. Are we alone? Are we not alone? Are there others with me, or am I completely alone? There's a sense that I'm not alone in many of these texts, because there is a voice that the subject is not able to own up. So there's a split or a gap between the voice and subject. Now think about it. As I'm talking now, I'm owning up the voice. I think it's my voice that I'm hearing, right? As I speak, I'm also hearing my voice. If this uncanny feeling sets in, though, that this is not my voice, right? I'm talking, but it's not my voice. I will have to assume that even if you guys were not here, there is someone else because it's not my voice. So if there is a split between the subject and the voice, automatically one will have to assume that there is an other. Okay, there is another. It can't just be this is not my voice. But the problem is there is no other. In the room, I don't see anyone else. I don't hear anyone else. I don't smell anyone else. So there's no rat to smell. So there is no other, and yet there has to be another because the voice I hear is not my voice. This is a problem that we see quite often in Beckett, and goes without saying it's again a sort of a philosophical problem. One could say it's like a mind-body problem, where you think your mind is something else, your body is another thing. There's a body and there's a mind, and again there's a split, just as there's a split between the voice and the subject, right? And the famous mind-body split was again, one of the Cartesian articulations, Descartes articulations, right? What kind of attitude should the unnamable adopt towards things? He talks about this idea of things. Let's keep this in suspension. We'll come back to this. The first other who seems to be there is Malone. And this is again taken over from the previous novel. Malone dies, the character Malone seems to be there in this weird kind of a placeless place, the hell that we're talking about. Of his mortal liveliness, little trace remains. He passes before me at doubtless regular intervals, unless it is I who pass before him. No, once and for all, I do not move. So again, one of the things that you see is that narration is provisional. In any book of fiction, narration creates a world, right? Narration produces a world. We start believing in it. We start buying that world. That's how a typical novel works. Here, everything seems to be left to the, arbitrary decision of the character. So suddenly the character can say, well, this is a square space. Or suddenly he could say, no, this is a round space. This is, circular. So again, what you see here, he's not able to decide whether he's actually moving, maybe crawling around, or he's totally static. In fact, he will not be able to decide later on whether he's in a particular position, whether he's, sitting on his back, or whether he's sort of lying down in a sort of supine position. So he's not going to be able to understand what position his body is in. And here he's trying to decide whether he's static or, and again, it seems to be a decision. There's no rationale for it. He just decides that, well, Malone passes, Malone wheels around me, I'm motionless. And there's a sort of a solar system-like movement here. But anyway, there will not be much on the subject of Malone, from whom there is nothing further to be hoped. I mean, he's dead. Nothing much can be hoped from him. Personally, I do not intend to be bored. It was while watching him pass that I wondered if he cast a shadow. So again, these are typical questions, people would think when they try to understand whether they're alive or not, whether they cast a shadow or not. If you don't cast a shadow, that's a typical horror trope, right? You feel like you're dead because there is no shadow. You're walking around and there's no shadow. There's I can't remember the name of the novel right now, but there was a novel called Shadowless, long back, in fact, in Spanish, I think, which talked about a character who suddenly realized he doesn't have a shadow and then gets freaked out, so starts freaking out. Am I dead? I don't have a shadow. But then starts talking to the shadow comes back. The novel is about his relationship with his shadow. Anyway, it's an interesting novel. Sometimes, so again, there is a lot of uncertainty, as I'm saying. We don't know whether this is Malone. It could also be Malloy. But there's an element of comical provisionality about everything. It's like, a character drawing something and deciding, well, it's not going to be daytime. And suddenly, I'm going to now sketch a moon here because I don't like the sun. It's not day. It's a bit like that. So there's a comical provisionality about this narration. So I wonder if it is not Molloy, he suddenly goes. Perhaps it is Molloy wearing Malone's hat. But it is more reasonable to suppose it is Malone wearing his own hat, right? So, one possibility is to think it's Molloy wearing Malone's hat, which is why he's fooling me as Malone. But then it's easier to think Malone is wearing his own hat rather than, Molloy wearing Malone's hat. So these, dry kind of Irish wit moments, they're there throughout the book. So it's at one level quite horrendous, but at another level, it's also quite funny. If you're able to read the typical sort of Irish dry humor, it's quite funny that way. But it is more reasonable to suppose, okay, that's fine. Perhaps Molloy is not here at all. Could he be? Without my knowledge. The place is no doubt vast. So see, there is an interest in how to measure the place this is. Dim, and there are these lights which flicker, and he's not able to understand. He calls it the disorder of the lights. Dim, intermittent lights suggest a kind of distance. To tell the truth, I believe they're all there, at least from Murphy on. So we also see a kind of an overlapping, or I should say enveloping, authorial consciousness. We're not sure who this author is, but it seems like, we are constantly going back to all the major characters Beckett has created so far. So Murphy was the first novel, and that's the protagonist. Maybe Murphy is here. Murphy died at the end of that novel, so of course he's in some hell. I believe we are all here, but so far I've only seen Malone, another hypothesis. They were here, but are here no longer. I shall examine it after my fashion. Are there other pits deeper down, to which one accedes by time stupid obsession with depth? So again, you see, he's kind of withdrawing his own suppositions. The moment he says pit, we understand maybe this could be some pit of hell, could be a space where there's a lot of depth. He's perhaps at the pit of a well or something like that. And then he says it's a stupid obsession with depth. What makes you think it's a depth? It could be a surface. It may not have to be. It doesn't have to be a space of depth. Are there other places set aside for us? And this one here, where I am with Malone, merely there now. These architectural terms he's going to use. Narthex is the sort of gateway to a place. I thought I had done with preliminaries. No, we've all been here forever. We shall all be here forever. I know it. There's also an attempt to get rid of the questions, but the questions keep coming back. Again, you see the comicality of this. No more questions, and the very next sentence is a question. Okay, so no more questions. Is not this rather the place where one finishes vanishing? So again, think about a place where you finished vanishing. So as if death wasn't the final vanishing act. Should have been, but it's a nightmare to find yourself still there after death. I mean, you wouldn't want that, right? Ideally. Death is like done. Okay, fine, perfect. After all these years, I'm done. But then you find yourself in some other place, in some stupid maze like this entity does. Will the day come when Malone will pass before me no more? Will the day come when Malone will pass before the spot where I was? Will the day come when another will pass before me, before the spot where I was? So all the questions come after the assertion, no more questions. And then I have no opinion on these matters. So there's another weird thing that is mentioned here. There's a constant tearing of his eyes. So whoever this character is, he's just crying throughout. But then it is said that he's not sad. He's not a sad character at all. So what is this? And the assumption is perhaps it is liquefied brain. Perhaps his brain is liquefying itself through all the tears. So he's literally bathed in tears. Right? And that's what is discussed here, or sort of described, I should say. Nothing ever troubles me, and yet I'm troubled. That's a typical problem. Nothing troubles me, and in spite of that, I'm troubled. This fear of change is another thing that we see throughout this book. How inert you are, and how you're always afraid of even little changes to the arrangement of the place. If there is any little change, you get afraid. You just want to keep things as they are. Malone seems to be wheeling around. So again, there's sort of an orbiting, and that's why I'm saying there's a sort of a solar system, as it were, in this place. So it seems like, this is a spot, let's say, where the Unnamable is, and Malone is wheeling around him. And at some point, it is compared with the movement of Earth and Moon. The thing there is, of course, Earth is also moving, which is problem that he considers, whether they're both moving in different orbits in different ways, and whether there's a sense of stasis, which is just an illusion, just as you think Earth is not moving. Yeah, all is clear. Here, all is clear. No, all is not clear. These are typical, moments of contradiction. They're there throughout the book. Contradiction is one of the biggest logical tropes in this novel, and it's called rhetoric. But the discourse must go on, so one invents obscurities, rhetoric. So rhetoricians may not be very happy about that, but the idea is you invent obscurities like rhetoric because you have to keep the discourse on. And it's again the same problem as I was saying, the inability to stop talking. And again, there could be a bit of there are various academic terms that are used throughout the book, like the word dissertation is used. Right? There could be a bit of a dig at the professorial figure, which is always there in Beckett. If you think about that famous moment in Waiting for Godot, where you put on the professor's hat and this slave, quote unquote, starts talking in a very tortuous way, and everyone gets like troubled by the way Lucky, this character, is speaking in Waiting for Godot. But there's a critique of the professorial speech. Perhaps there's again a critique of the professorial speech, because at certain points, the Unnamable seems to consider himself as a professor. There are also moments where he considers himself as a student. And there are these others, we will soon get introduced to these wonderful people, Basil and Mahood and all these characters. They are, as it were, pedagogic figures. They're figures of the master, the teacher as the master. So the rhetorics, okay, and then these lights, as I said, which I do not require to mean anything. What is there so strange about them, so wrong? Is it their irregularity, their instability? So they're like little stars. They don't shine all along. They shine strong 1 minute and they go weak the very next. So this is the disorder of the lights. But never beyond the power of 1 or 2 candles. Malone appears and disappears with the punctuality of clockwork, always at the same remove, the same velocity, in the same direction, the same attitude. But the play of the lights is truly unpredictable. So you can't predict when they go strong, when they come weak. They're unhinging the Unnamable, as it were. Now, just one quick pause to consider this. I mean, someone who does not believe in the I, someone who says I without believing in it, as we saw, that is perhaps the reason why that character cannot be named. A character who does not identify with any kind of pronoun, how do you give it a noun? Name is a noun, right? A proper name is a noun that you invent for that character. But how do you name a character who cannot identify with himself or herself? That's, I think, one of the implications of the Unnamable. But the Unnamable also has connotations of terror, right? Something that is so terrible that you can't name it. It's so fearful that you can't name it. Again, to sort of go back to that war camp allegory that I'm trying to sort of, push here. But the mere fact of asking myself such a question gives me to reflect. So again, this, as I said, this impossibility not to reflect, but all thought is like a torture for that. It's not easy, and it leads him to all kinds of uncertainties, leads him to all kinds of questions, and there's no answer for any of those questions. So that's why these thoughts are terrifying. One reason why his thoughts are terrifying to him is that they don't lead him to any kind of knowledge. It's like you keep thinking without knowing anything. And that's a torture, right? You would want to know something. Again, I'm not going to go into everything. Of course, we can't read everything. Incomprehensible uneasiness. That's the lights. The lights kind of blind him, as it were. But there are some sounds as well. So he's not deaf. He's able to listen to certain sounds. I remember the first sound heard in this place. I've often heard it since. For I'm obliged to assign a beginning to my residence here. So he's trying to imagine how he came into this place, but not able to imagine that, right? There's no backstory again. We don't know how, why. And again, the reference to hell, as I was saying, hell itself, although eternal, dates from the revolt of Lucifer. So apparently, even hell had some sort of a beginning. So why can't I have a beginning? That's his problem. It is therefore permissible, in the light of this distant analogy, to think of myself as being here forever, but not as having been here forever. So again, you see the contradiction. To think of myself as being here forever, but not as having been here forever. So again, the contradiction that neutralizes kind of knowledge claim. If you contradict yourself and keep contradicting yourself, you'll not be able to produce a knowledge claim. That's a classic problem of a researcher. And if you think of the unnamable as a student who's being taught these things by the tyrannical masters, he has these tyrannical masters, the others, but it seems like, you know, he's not a very good student, but that's actually a good thing in this case. He's able to forget everything the masters throw down his unit. But we'll come back to that. But he's also aware of the fact that he wants to know things, and that's the problem. That's why he gets frustrated. This is again a famous line: deplorable mania when something happens to inquire what. The moment something happens, we are paranoidally interested in, oh, what does it mean? What does it mean? Anything we see, anything we hear, we keep thinking, what does it mean? That is the deplorable mania. So there are sounds, but you don't know what they mean. And then this last sentence, a very Swiftian sentence, again, a very famous one from the Unnamable: a man may die at the age of 70 without ever having had the possibility of seeing Halley's comet, right? Because it comes after 70 years, or more than that. So again, the wit is, what's the point in thinking too highly about yourself, about your life? You can't even see a fucking Halley's comet. What about that? So anyway, right. So it is no doubt time I gave a companion to Malone. So who is this companion? Again, see how he's going back to all his previous creations, as if he's the author of all the creations. Mercier Camion, the pseudo couple. This is an expression he has used earlier. A lot of critics have seen this in a sort of, homosocial, homoerotic way, that Beckett has all these pseudo couples, both men, and he's often said that they're modeled after him and his wife, which further goes back to that whole question of sexual preference. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that because that's not what we are talking about here. But he's trying to imagine a company, a companion to Malone. So again, you see the provisionality. It's like a magician. Let me have a company for this character. Let me invent another character to give company to this one. Right? So let me have Mercier and Camion. But then they are withdrawn. Eventually, they're not there. It's just a thought that he wants to have some company for Malone, but then he decides not to have. I've already mentioned the tearful part, the fact that these are liquefied brains, and but of course the larger question is, again, the cerebral process of thinking seems to produce a kind of torture, and the brain is liquefying all across the body as it were. That's again going back to that idea of thinking as torture, which I'm trying to push here, the sort of Cartesian idea. Am I a human being? This question keeps coming back. Why did I have myself represented in the midst of men, the light of day? It seems to me it was none of my doing. So there's this obligation to be human, but one does not know whether one is actually human. So this questioning of the humanity of the subject is something that we often see in Beckett. And again, one could relate it to the post-war context. When you've seen something like that, it's difficult to consider yourself human. That's the point when, again, someone like Freud starts talking about death drive and almost disbelieves this idea that human beings believe in a kind of ontological peace. And it goes back in a way to some of those early sort of contractarian political theory. If you think about Leviathan and Hobbes's idea of human beings always being at war with themselves. The state of the nature is war, as Hobbes famously said. Anyway, going into different things here, but let's come back. This whole question of knowledge Can there be knowledge? Can there be innate? Again, these are very old Cartesian questions. Descartes would famously call certain kinds of ideas clear and distinct ideas, because for him, these are innate ideas. And this has always been a major question. What is it that we know from birth? Do we at all know anything from birth? Or is knowledge something which is kind of rammed into us as we go on living, right? Do we at all have any innate knowledge, right? This is again that famous moment in Plato's dialogues where we have the slave who is able to do all these complex geometrical, kinds of equations on the board, is able to draw all these things. And everyone is amazed. How does the slave know all this? The slave is illiterate, right? And that leads to this particular idea in Plato that there's some intuition before knowledge, which is perhaps mathematical. Anyway, I mean, we're going into a different direction. I'll not develop this point, but anyway, this idea that what kind of knowledge do we have? And the reference to the mother, innate knowledge of my mother, for example, is that conceivable? So when I am born, am I born with the knowledge of the mother? Is an infant born with this knowledge that there is someone who has mothered me, who has literally produced me, I mean, from her body? Is it an innate knowledge? Again, these are questions. But there are some interesting points here to keep. As I said, especially when Beckett was translating this novel, May Beckett, his mother, died. Before that, he has always had this very savage, loving, as I was saying, very peculiar, complicated relationship with his mother. One of the funnier things about that is that, as he says in one of the letters, that, I'm doing this psychotherapy with Bjorn, and we are constantly talking about my mother, and I'm, as it were, trying to exorcise my mother. But who's paying for the psychotherapy? My mother, right? So I'm still dependent on her financially. She's paying to exorcise herself from my mind, right? So there's that weird kind of thing, and this is very typical. In fact, some of these authors, there's very, very interesting stories if you think about their relationships with their mother, like Baudelaire, because he was so weird and so much of a spendthrift. Baudelaire's mother had a legal contract with him that, if you spend more than this, there'll be some sort of a punishment for that. It'll be like a legal thing. So, I mean, now it's easy to, whatever, through net banking, freeze your account if you spend more than 40,000 a month or something like that. But he was so much of a squanderer that his mother had put a sort of limit on that. But the problem is, of course, they were not dependent a little bit, some of these authors, right? Anyway, they are not independent. Atmanirbhar. Huh? Yeah. I mean, Althusser's things are much more sinister. Let me not go into that. Also ended up killing his wife, but maybe in one of those spells. But yeah, let's not get into that. That's a very controversial thing. Okay, so yeah, this whole idea of they, we will see all these others, days throughout the book. There will be some names for them. These days, especially the two characters, we see very clearly. Again, we're not sure whether they are characters, but they are representative of this very powerful other. The other that is always trying to engulf the self. The other which is attacking the self, the other that wants to kill the self. It's like a crocodile's mouth. The other is like a crocodile's mouth. Basile and Mahound. And throughout this novel, we'll see how the Unnamable will constantly try to differentiate itself from these two characters. But they are like masters, right? So what we have here is this idea of lesson. There's also the word pensum, which is a very religious word that is being used here. So there are various lessons that he has been given. They gave me courses on most precious, most precious. They also taught me to count and even to reason. Some of this rubbish has come in handy on occasions. I don't deny it. On occasions which would never have arisen if they had left me in peace. So it's like, because they have put me into some really difficult crisis situations, I've had to use some of the knowledge they gave me. Otherwise, I had no use for them. I didn't even want to, right? So this is again the typical sort of idea of defiance, and we see this throughout. This kind of a weird resistance. I wouldn't call it weird, actually. Some of this resistance to the other.
the engulfing other and the subject's resistance to the other. But the problem is this I, whatever this I is, the unnameable, has to constantly see itself as a non-Basil or non-Mahmoud. So this is the problem, when the self has to establish itself, it has to differentiate itself from the other, right? If the self becomes the other, there is no self. Or if the other becomes the self, again, there is no self. So you have to constantly say that, for example, when you're playing cricket, you have to constantly say you're not Sachin Tendulkar, right? That's how you get some sense of self, right? Or whatever, Virat Kohli, whoever wants to be Virat Kohli, nevertheless. Fasil, non-Mahmoud, that's how you want to designate yourself. And then you realize, okay, you're kind of dependent on them because you have to designate yourself only by negating them. So you're becoming dependent on them and you don't like them, right? So this is again the tussle we see. But these characters are his teachers. They taught him to count, to reason, to make love, to have intelligence, everything. And they also filled him with hatred. Just going to finish, but I want to talk about something else before we end. Yeah, so as I say, this problem of starting to speak but not able to finish anything. One starts speaking as if it were possible to stop at will. It is better so. The search for the means to put an end to things, an end to speech, is what enables the discourse to continue. So you talk only because you want to stop talking. But what if you talk and you keep talking and you don't know how to, again, stop talking? Think about it. This is also a bit of a, if you think about it, a bit of a mimicry of the professorial speech. The professor who doesn't know where to stop, doesn't know when to stop because doesn't want to stop, right? The classic case. I want to teach forever, till the end of time, till love parts us. The search for the means to put an end. So as I said, method, the word method, it keeps coming back. Method or no method, I shall have to banish them in the end. What are these thems? What is this them? The beings, things, shapes, sounds, and lights with which my haste to speak has encumbered this place. In the frenzy of utterance, the concern with truth. So there's also an attempt to tell the truth. Again, a typical camp-like situation where you have to tell some truth about yourself. Only when will they let you go? Perhaps they will not let you go, they will kill you. But that's the idea. You're constantly asked to produce some truth. Hence the interest of a possible deliverance by means of encounter, but not so fast. First dirty, then make clean. Swachh Bharat. Okay. The old chestnut that he talks about here. These are all the figures he's talking about. Again, Malone revolves, as I see. Malone is revolving around him. He's static. The unnameable is static. Again, there is an understanding of a very sort of broken kind of nature, if at all there is any nature. If there is a sky, if there is something nightly about the place, something nocturnal, there seems to be these veils, nature from this place, whatever this place is, some depth, some pit, or some strange surface. As I said, Basil is mentioned here. Basil and his crew, to rest me from seeing, to rest me from waking, to darken me to sleep, and no longer look away or down or up, open to heaven, but must remain forever fixed and starting on the narrow space, staring on the narrow space, before then where there is nothing to be seen, 99% of the time. And so there's a reference to the eyes here and the act of seeing, the retina and so on, and that's why it comes back. The color of this place seems to be gray. At this point, it is called gray. Later on, this will be called a black void. But here it's gray. And think about gray. Gray is neither white nor black. Gray is one of those intermediate colors, right? And again, as I say, there are these religious references. We'll have more to say on these as we go on. I'm Matthew, I'm the angel. I who came before the cross, before the sinning, came into the world, came here. So there's possibly, let's just make one quick remark on this. There's possibly an appeal to Christianity to sort of address this question of suffering, because we are talking about a suffering subject, a subject who's in, and if the war camp or the death camp is the hell, there's some association, and this is again very typical in post-war literature, this sort of a despairing appeal to religion, as it were. And the idea is, of course, because of the war, some people have become unbelievers. They're not able to believe in Christianity or any, consorted religion that way, like before, because, of course, they feel like, how can God or whoever the prime master is able to allow stuff like a world war, things like a world war? So there's a certain disillusionment with religion, and hence an attempt to constantly code suffering around religion or encode human suffering with the sort of nitty-gritties of religion. But again, I'll have more to say on this as we go on. Let's see where. Yeah, this is the end of the preamble. Let me just finish with one final point, just to end. So as I said, if you look at this last bit of the so-called preamble, because again, this is a very typical, way of writing an epic where you write an invocation in the beginning. And this is like a preamble to the rest of the novel. This is not really divided in chapters, unlike the Gertrude Stein novel that we were talking about. So again, there's no cause for anxiety, and yet I'm anxious. So I'm not heading for disaster. I'm not heading anywhere. My adventures are over. My say said. I call that my adventures, and yet I feel not, as if there's something more to be done or somewhere more to be gone. And yet I do not despair of one day sparing me without going silent. So again, that quest for silence. And that day, I don't know why, I shall be able to go silent and make an end. I know it. Yes, the hope is there, once again, of not making me, not losing me, of staying here where I said I've always been. But I had to say something quick, of ending here. It would be wonderful. But is it to be wished? Yes, it is to be wished. To end would be wonderful, no matter who I am, no matter where I am. So this again, the seeking the ending of things, which is in a way the ending of words in silence. So we'll stop here, but one quick point before first we finish. Let's start thinking about what would be a good range of dates for your final assignment. Right, as a group, I don't mind as long as it stays within the academic calendar. So, I mean, you can think about this as a group in the sense that, of course, we can have some, leeway, which is why I'm asking you to decide. Around the 24th, we'll have the final class. And after that, we have at least a week. Now, it's up to you whether you want a sort of early submission, 25, 26, one submission will be away and you can concentrate on other courses, or would you want a late one towards the end of the thing? I mean, again, don't have to decide right now. I just wanted to give that thought to everyone who's on Zoom and here in the classroom as well. You can collectively discuss this and let me know what would be a good range. Of course, it can't be 10th of December, because I think that's the time when the results will come out. Will have to come out, right? I think we'll have to see the academic calendar, but I have a feeling it can't be. So the earliest could be 25, right? And I think the latest will have to be somewhere around 1st or 2nd, not more than that. Because usually the policy that is there, and this time I can't really allow extensions, not at all, because there's like a 72-hour policy we have for grading. So there is a certain final date by which all the exams have to take place. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that's 1st or 2nd, if I remember correctly. And then days, the results are supposed to be, as in the grades are supposed to be uploaded by us. And the rest is the academic office, And I think you're supposed to get the result around 8th or 9th. So that's a rough estimation. I'm not 100% sure. And I don't want to get into this computer again to check that. But in case you can you just check the academic calendar once, if others are here too? I think it would be round about that. That would be the rough range, 26 to around 2 or something. Right? So if you want it early, we could arrange it like that, where I will
release the questions 1 week ahead of time, so around 20th, let's say, and around 26, 27, you submit, or you could get some more days and do it around the first and the second. I am only saying this early thing because you might have too many assignments at that point, the first, second, that time. So if you want, we could do it a little bit early. Right, right. And does it say about grades up? Because I think if you go to the calendar, it will give you all those dates. Grade up to. Hmm? So December 3, I have to upload. Okay. Your range comes down further. I'm sorry. But December 3, I have to upload, get the scripts by latest, yeah, 30th, right? So you could do a little bit earlier, or you could do in a way that we have the submission on the 30th. So this you can decide, right? I mean, some of the people who are on Zoom are perhaps on campus. Those who are not on campus could also, let me know what works easier. Anyway, I mean, you could have, I'm sure you have some WhatsApp group where you can decide this. But very quickly before we finish, uh, Angel, how are you doing? If I may ask, I know you had,
I'm okay, sir. Thank you.
you don't have any symptoms, right?
No, I'm much better. I had only like a stuffy nose situation, but now it's fine.
And how many days has it been?
It's been 7 days, 8 days. Today is the 8th day.
Okay. So hopefully whatever the worst was is over, and
Yeah.
be on a sort of recovery path. Good to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And yeah, I think we could stop here. You guys, I mean, decide slowly. We have some time. I just wanted to begin that conversation. Sorry. And we can come back to this. Okay. So day after tomorrow, I see you at the same time. Thank you.